They said the world had stopped, just for a moment. On a gray September day, from the remote islands of the Pacific to the frenetic heart of Manhattan, a strange and shared silence descended. It was not merely the passing of a monarch, but the closing of a chapter so vast it had touched every corner of the globe. For 7 decades, she had been a constant, a face on stamps, a figure in history books, a quiet presence through wars and wonders. Now she was gone. What follows is not the story of that day, but of the year that unfolded in its wake, a year of quiet pilgrimages and roaring parades of personal grief in distant lands, and of a global conversation about legacy, memory, and the intangible threads that connect us. This is the story of how the world remembered Queen Elizabeth II. The first ripple of the news spread not through official proclamations, but through the eerie, simultaneous hush that seemed to fall over crowds gathered around public screens in London. A businessman in Tokyo, watching the BBC feed before bed, saw the change in the newsreader's tie, the somber black, and knew before the words were spoken. In a Nairobi market, a vendor's radio crackled with a bulletin, and he slowly lowered his volume, the sudden quiet causing others to look his way. The digital age made the announcement instantaneous, yet the reactions were profoundly, humanly slow. A fisherwoman in Newfoundland heard it from her son's phone call and walked to the edge of the dock, looking out at the cold Atlantic, remembering a young queen's visit decades past. In Sydney, the towering sails of the Opera House were dimmed as the sunset blazed, a modern monument honoring a life steeped in tradition. This was the beginning of a global vigil. Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowd was not just British. There was Sophia, a nurse from Portugal, who placed a single white lily because her grandfather had spoken of the Queen's grace during the Carnation Revolution. There was Arjun, a software engineer from India, who took a picture of the growing sea of flowers, thinking of his grandmother's stories of independence and the complicated, enduring link between their nations. The bouquets came with notes in dozens of languages attached to Paddington bears, marmalade sandwiches, and corgi plush toys, tributes not to a distant ruler, but to a grandmotherly figure pop culture had made familiar. The silence in these crowds was punctuated not by sobs, but by the soft rustle of cellophane, the scratch of a pen on card, and the whispered sharing of memories between strangers who, for this moment, were neighbors in grief. Meanwhile, in a workshop in the English countryside, a craftsman smoothed his hand over a length of ancient, seasoned oak. This was no ordinary wood. It had been earmarked for a special purpose years before. In Canada, a government protocol officer reopened a binder not touched in 70 years, the pages crisp and the instructions eerily prescient. Across the Commonwealth, tailors brushed dark fabric, and musicians began to practice the somber, stately marches that had last filled the air a lifetime ago. The machinery of ceremony, both ancient and modern, was stirring. It was a testament to an institution that understood the power of ritual, of visible continuity in the face of rupture. Yet, for all the planning, no one could script the human response. In a small Jamaican community, elders debated whether to fly the flag at half-mast, a discussion weaving together respect for the individual and a complex colonial history. The tribute was global, but it was not uniform. It was filtered through the unique lens of every nation's shared and separate past with the crown. The funeral itself was a spectacle of precision, a global television event watched by billions. But within the pageantry were tiny, raw human moments the cameras barely caught. The new king's minute tremor as he signed the proclamation, the Princess Royal's steadfast salute as her mother's coffin passed, the crumbling face of a guardsman as he stood watch through the night. The world saw the crown, the orb, the scepter placed upon the coffin, but they also saw a family, bereaved, weary, and public property. As the final hymn echoed in Westminster Abbey and the coffin began its last journey to Windsor, the focus started to subtly shift. The intense, collective weeping of the prior 10 days began to soften into reflection. The flowers at the palace gates would eventually be cleared, transformed into compost for the royal parks, a cycle of life and renewal quietly noted and appreciated by many. The first chapter of public mourning was closing, but the deeper, more personal work of remembrance was just beginning. As the last echoes of the funeral marches faded, the world entered a quieter, more introspective phase. The spectacle was over, but the feeling remained. In cities around the globe, books of condolence remained open in town halls and embassies, their pages filling with careful script from people of all ages. A teenager in Cardiff wrote about how the Queen's televised Christmas messages had been a constant in her fractured childhood home. A veteran in Auckland, his hands shaking, simply wrote, "Thank you, ma'am." The act of writing was a deliberate, personal ritual, a way to physically connect to the event, to add one's own small voice to the historical record. This period saw the rise of spontaneous, grassroots tributes in unexpected places. In a Tokyo karaoke bar, a group of elderly British expats, not usually given a public display, solemnly sang Vera Lynn's "We'll Meet Again." In a school in rural Kenya, children planted a circle of 70 olive trees, one for each year of the rain, learning about sustainability as they honored a memory. An artist in Buenos Aires created a delicate street mural not of the Queen in regalia, but of her as a young woman in uniform during the war, a side of her life less known in South America. These acts are not coordinated by any central authority. They were the organic outpouring of a global community piecing together what her reign had meant. The media landscape transformed from rolling news coverage to deep-dive documentaries and personal essays. Newspapers in Fiji, Singapore, and Cyprus published special editions filled not just with official biographies, but with local stories. The time she visited after a hurricane, the scholarship fund she patronized that educated a now prominent doctor, the brief wave from a royal car that became a family's treasured anecdote for generations. Podcasts featured historians from the Caribbean, discussing the Windrush generation's complex relationship with the monarchy, and fashion commentators in Milan analyzed her iconic, message-laden use of color. The monolithic figure was being broken down into a million points of light, each reflecting a different aspect of her impact. This was also the time when the more challenging conversations found space to breathe. In public squares from Glasgow to Melbourne, debates were held not about the Queen personally, but about the institution she embodied. Students in Lagos organized a respectful discussion on the future of the Commonwealth. Academics in Dublin gave lectures on the nuanced diplomatic shifts her reign had witnessed between Britain and Ireland. There was no single, unified narrative. The tribute was becoming a global dialogue, sometimes agreeing, sometimes dissenting, but always engaged. The quiet respect for the woman who had served was allowing for a more honest conversation about the crown she wore. Through this, a more complete, more human picture of her legacy was being assembled, piece by piece, memory by memory, all across the world. With the arrival of summer, the nature of the tributes evolved once more, becoming more celebratory and forward-looking. The somberness began to lift, replaced by a focus on continuity and the historical footprint of an era now definitively past. The first milestone was the new king's coronation. While a distinctly different event, it was viewed universally through the lens of his mother's legacy. Commentators everywhere noted the echoes of her 1953 ceremony. The same chair, the same oath, and the deliberate modifications that spoke to a modern, changed world. The global audience watched, comparing and contrasting, seeing not just a new king being crowned, but the end of the Elizabethan age being formally sealed. The vibrant, diverse pageantry of the Commonwealth processions served as a living, breathing tribute to the geopolitical tapestry she had helped steward. Museums and galleries worldwide launched exhibitions that moved beyond biography into thematic exploration. A major museum in New York opened Elizabeth II, the Diplomacy of Color, showcasing her wardrobe as a tool of international relations. A gallery in Edinburgh presented the Commonwealth, a collection of photographs of the Queen taken by local photographers from over 50 nations, presenting her not as a visiting dignitary, but as a figure seen through dozens of cultural perspectives. In a small museum in Tasmania, a humble display featured letters from local children to the Queen from the 1960s, alongside her office's typed replies, highlighting the relentless, human touch of her correspondence. This period also saw the cementing of more permanent memorials. A new, resilient species of rose was cultivated and, named Elizabeth II's Legacy, its seeds distributed to botanical gardens from Kerala to Brazil. Village halls in remote parts of Scotland and New Zealand, long ago granted patronage, installed simple, carved plaques reading in grateful memory. A composer from Trinidad, inspired by the syncopated rhythms of the funeral drums at Windsor, wrote a symphonic piece that premiered in London, blending traditions in a sonic tribute. These were not statues of bronze, but living, growing, sounding memorials that would evolve with time. Perhaps the most profound tributes were the acts of service that cascaded through communities. Inspired by the Queen's lifetime of duty, volunteer organizations from Canada to South Africa reported a surge in inquiries. People organized local cleanups, visiting programs for the elderly, and charity drives in her name. A phrase from her famous 21st birthday speech, "My whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service," was quoted in newsletters and, on social media, revitalized for a new generation. The tribute was no longer about looking back in sorrow, but about channeling respect into positive, tangible action. Her life was becoming a framework for others to build upon, transforming global grief into local good. As autumn leaves began to turn, marking the full cycle of a year, reflections took on a deeper, more personal and philosophical tone. The initial shock and the celebratory commemorations had passed, leaving a space for individuals and nations to assess what exactly had been lost and what remained. The anniversary of the passing was not marked by a single event, but by 1,000 quiet moments of reckoning. In living rooms from Aberdeen to Adelaide, families watched old footage, the young Queen smiling in Kenya, the steadfast address during the pandemic, and grandparents shared stories with wide-eyed children for whom she was already a figure from history books. The media produced a year on specials, but the most powerful narratives came from ordinary people. A documentary filmed in a multicultural London school showed children discussing the Queen's role. One boy of Polish descent said she was like the oldest friend of the country, while a girl whose parents were from Ghana thoughtfully wondered about the friends Britain might have lost during the Empire. These candid, unscripted perspectives showed how her symbol was being processed by the generation who would inherit her legacy. Meanwhile, in online forums, genealogists and hobbyists shared discoveries of their tenuous connections to the reign. A great-grandfather who worked on the coronation coach, a letter from a great-aunt who was in the crowds in 1953. People were weaving their own family threads into the vast tapestry of the Elizabethan era, claiming their small part in history. Globally, the focus turned to the intangible inheritance. Editorial writers in India spoke of her as a constant in a world of flux, a symbol of stability through the chaos of the Cold War, technological revolution, and global pandemics. Psychologists discussed the grandmother archetype she had come to embody for many, regardless of nationality, a symbol of resilience, decorum, and quiet strength. The tributes were now less about what she did and more about what she represented, an anchor, a point of reference in a rapidly changing century. This was particularly poignant in former colonies, where complex debates continued. In a university in Kingston, Jamaica, a symposium titled "The Queen and Us," a complex reckoning, allowed for both respectful acknowledgement of her personal dignity and critical examination of the institution's past, exemplifying the mature, multifaceted global relationship she had personally navigated. On the eve of the anniversary, a simple, powerful gesture united the Commonwealth. At sundown in each time zone, from the beaches of the Bahamas to the peaks of New Zealand, beacons were lit, not in a coordinated, simultaneous blast, but in a gentle, rolling wave of light across the planet. It was a visual metaphor for her reign, not a single, blinding spotlight, but a constant, warm glow passing from one community to the next through the night until it completed its journey around the world. As people gathered on hillsides and in parks to watch their local beacon flame, the feeling was not of a wake, but of a quiet, communal vigil for an epic now peacefully laid to rest. The final stage of the year of tributes was not about grand ceremonies, but about the subtle, enduring ways a legacy settles into the fabric of everyday life. The intense, focused period of mourning and public remembrance had ebbed, leaving behind a changed landscape. The Queen's image on currency, stamps, and official buildings was gradually being replaced by that of the new king, a visual, constant reminder of the transition. Yet in countless small ways, her presence persisted, woven into the world's cultural and social consciousness. The commercial and commemorative artifacts of a year, the special edition magazines, the china plates, the documentary box sets, found their way onto shelves, becoming the physical archive of this global moment. But more enduring were the artistic interpretations. A playwright in Nigeria finished a work exploring the concept of duty through the lens of a fictional African elder and the late queen, finding parallel lines in seemingly disparate lives. A renowned Japanese anime studio announced a short, respectful film inspired by her love of corgis and horses, introducing her to a new, young audience in an entirely different cultural language. Her story was being metabolized by global creativity, ensuring its relevance for audiences with no direct memory of her. Institutions that bore her patronage, from the Royal Ballet to obscure charities supporting deaf children in Australia, felt a profound sense of stewardship. Their annual reports that year invariably included a tribute page, not as nostalgia, but as a reaffirmation of their mission, inspired by her long association. A scholarship fund for young environmentalists in her name saw record applications from across the Commonwealth, channeling respect into future-facing action. The legacy was being operationalized, turned into engines for education, conservation, and the arts. The most significant and perhaps most surprising tribute was the evolution of the global conversation around monarchy itself. The year of reflection had, in many nations, separated the woman from the institution. Polls showed that while Republican sentiments continued in various places, there was also a widespread, cross-generational respect for Elizabeth II personally as a figure of historic magnitude. She had become, in death, a singular historical benchmark. Historians began referring to the late 20th and early 21st centuries as the Elizabethan period in global texts, a term that spoke not of British power, but of a specific era of transformation witnessed under one remarkable lifespan. Finally, the story returned to where it began, not with institutions, but with individuals. On a rainy afternoon in November, an elderly woman in a headscarf, just one among thousands, laid a small posy of late-blooming flowers against the wall of Windsor Castle. No cameras were there. It was a simple, private act of remembrance, one of countless such acts that would continue for years in places both grand and humble. The global torrent of grief had become a steady, quiet stream of memory. The world, in its own way, had kept its promise to remember. It had done so not with a single deafening salute, but with a year-long, layered, and deeply human symphony of tribute, a testament to a life that, for better or worse, had been a quiet companion to the world for an age. And in that ongoing, ordinary act of remembrance, her story found its most authentic, enduring conclusion. The world had moved through a full year of seasons since that September day. The loud and public sadness was now a quiet and private memory. The news stories had faded, but in small towns and big cities across the globe, the story of Queen Elizabeth II was not over. It was simply changing. It was moving from the front pages of newspapers into the hearts and daily lives of ordinary people. This new chapter was not about looking back with tears. It was about looking around and seeing how one very long life had quietly changed the world. In a small village in the hills of Scotland, an old man named Finlay took his grandson for a walk. He pointed to a simple stone bridge over a rushing stream. "See that bridge, lad? It was built in 1953, the year she was crowned. They called it the Coronation Bridge." The boy touched the mossy stone. To him, the Queen was a picture in a school book. But the bridge was real. It was part of his walk to school every day. All over the world, this was happening. People began to see the footprint of the Elizabethan age in their own communities. It was in the community centers built for her Silver Jubilee in 1977. It was in the trees planted for her Golden Jubilee in 2002. It was in the plaques on village halls and the names of parks and libraries. Her reign was not just in history books. It was in the bricks and mortar of everyday life. People who had never thought much about the monarchy realized they were living in places she had helped shape simply by being the Queen for so long. The way people remembered her also became more personal and less formal. In a cafe in Melbourne, Australia, a group of friends in their 70s met for coffee. They did not talk about politics or pageantry. One woman, named Margaret, laughed and said, "My mother insisted we had to be quiet during the Christmas message. Every year, we would be bursting with energy on Christmas afternoon, but we had to sit still for 10 minutes while that calm voice came from the television." Her friend John nodded. "I remember when she visited here in 1954. My father held me on his shoulders. I didn't see much, but I remember the feeling. It was like electricity in the crowd." These were not grand memories. They were small, warm pieces of a shared past. On the internet, on social media, people from Canada to Kenya shared similar stories. A man posted a photo of a very old stamp with a young queen's face. He wrote, "My grandmother used to save these for me. She said, 'One day, you'll tell your grandchildren you lived when Queen Elizabeth was ruling.'" The memory of the Queen was becoming a key that unlocked people's own family stories and their personal history. Artists and creators continued to find new ways to think about her life and what it meant. A famous musician in Nigeria wrote a song not about the Queen, but about the idea of duty. The song was about a village elder, a mother, and a teacher. It talked about the quiet weight of responsibility. Many people who heard it thought of the Queen, even though her name was never sung. In Japan, a popular manga artist created a beautiful short story about a girl and her dog, a corgi. The story was about loyalty and friendship that lasts a lifetime. Readers in Japan saw the connection and learned about the Queen's love for her dogs. In this way, her story traveled to new places in new forms. It was no longer a British story. It was a human story that could be told in any language. The businesses and shops of the world also reflected this lasting memory. But it was not about cheap souvenirs anymore. A very fine porcelain company in England made a limited set of plates. Each plate showed a different breed of horse that the Queen loved. They were not bought by tourists. They were bought by people who loved horses, who wanted to remember the Queen as a fellow rider. A puzzle company made a difficult jigsaw puzzle of the famous photograph of the Queen sitting alone at her husband's funeral during the pandemic. It was a sad image, but many people bought the puzzle. Putting it together felt like a quiet, thoughtful act of respect. A bookshop in Toronto, Canada, had a special section that stayed up all year. It was not just biographies of the Queen. It was books about the history of the Commonwealth, about leadership, about women in power. People browsed this section slowly, wanting to understand the world she lived in. Perhaps the most important change was in the many charities and organizations she supported. These groups did not close their doors. They felt a new sense of purpose. A wildlife charity in Africa that the Queen had loved for decades launched a new campaign. They called it the Elizabeth Canopy. Its goal was to protect ancient forests across the Commonwealth. People donated money from all over the world. They gave not just because they cared about trees, but because they wanted to honor her love for the natural world. A program that helped young people learn to read in the Caribbean got more volunteers. People said she would want this work to continue. Her name became a powerful reason to do good things. Her lifetime of service was inspiring a new wave of service in others. School children around the world now learned about her in a different way. In a history class in Delhi, India, the teacher asked, "What can one person's long life tell us about the 20th century?" The students talked about how she was a link to the past. She had served in World War II. She had seen men walk on the moon. She had used a telegram and later sent an email. Her life was a timeline of incredible change. In a civics class in Auckland, New Zealand, students debated the future of the Commonwealth. They talked about its problems, but also about why so many different countries chose to stay in this family of nations. The Queen was no longer a distant icon. She was a case study. Her reign was a tool for learning about history, geography, diplomacy, and even technology. The royal family itself continued its work, and the public watched them with the memory of the Queen always in the background. When the new king made his first visit to Kenya, journalists wrote about how his mother had visited as a young princess in 1952 when she became queen. They compared the trips, noting how much Kenya and the world had changed. When the Princess of Wales spoke gently to a child, people online would write, "The Queen would be so proud." The family's actions were now seen as a continuation of her legacy. The public looked for her values in them, a sense of duty, a calm manner, a love for people. As the second year without her began, the loud tributes were truly over. There were no more big television specials. The flowers were long gone from the palace gates. But if you knew where to look, you could see her memory everywhere. It was in a volunteer pulling weeds in a community garden named in her honor. It was in the student studying for a scholarship that carried her name. It was in the grandparent telling a sleepy child a story that began with a long time ago when the Queen was still alive. Her presence had become a gentle background rhythm in the song of the world. The story of Queen Elizabeth II was no longer a news story. It was becoming history, but it was a living history. It was in the bridges people crossed, in the stories they told, in the good works they did, and in the lessons children learned. She had reigned for 70 years, and in that time, she had quietly become a part of the world's landscape. And long after the last person who remembered her was gone, that landscape would remain, shaped in countless small ways by the woman who promised, as a young girl, to give her whole life to service. The world had remembered her for a year, but in a way, by carrying her example forward, it would remember her for much, much longer.